مئات الآلاف من الوثائق المرتبطة بالمنطقة العربية والشرق سيتم تحويلها من صيغتها الورقية أو المادية إلى ملفات إلكترونية توضع في بنك معلومات المكتبة البريطانية على شبكة الإنترنت. هذا المشروع المشترك بين مؤسسة قطر والمكتبة البريطانية سيتيح للباحثين والأكاديميين الاطلاع على وثائق وخرائط وصور فوتوغرافية وحتى الاستماع إلى موسيقى نادرة من فترة وجود البريطانيين في منطقة الشرق، لا سيما منذ بدايات القرن الثامن عشر وحتى الربع الأخير من القرن العشرين. نشر مثل هذه المعلومات على موقع المكتبة البريطانية التي تحتوي على 14 مليون كتاب و150 مليون مقتنى وتعتبر إحدى أكبر المكتبات العامة في أوروبا سيساهم في إظهار العديد من المعطيات الجديدة والكشف عن خبايا العلاقات العربية البريطانية.
Here at the British Library, we're digitising a wealth of material relating to the history of the Gulf region and the wider Arabic-speaking world. And so we're building an online catalogue to host content which will include manuscripts, archival material, sound recordings, maps relating to the history of the region, and we're producing that through this online catalogue in two languages, Arabic and English. The project is a really important opportunity for the British Library and for our partners at the Qatar Foundation and for Arabic speakers, I think, around the region.
Well, it's an obvious activity for something like a library or indeed any cultural organisation to find ways of making their collections available for people to use. And the work that we're doing with the Qatar Foundation is a perfect opportunity for us to do exactly that. It's very important because in a sense it represents a sort of paradigm of exactly what we should be doing, which is making our collections available online and doing so in such a way that we have a chance to recatalogue this material, which means putting an extra resource to make it available. And the reason we're doing that is because that's all aimed at allowing people to get at it more easily, to be able to use it, to enjoy it, to share it with their friends on phones, mobile phones or other devices, to share it in a research environment, for museum curators to use it for whatever purposes they wish to use it for. Mass availability of this kind of material is bound to reignite and re-enthuse research in the Gulf and in the past. And of course, particularly in the context of how fast the Gulf is changing, making available material which covers the past, reflects what has happened from the 1950s backwards through to the 18th century, is going to have a major transformative effect. While digitising records from the India office is obviously an extremely important part of the project, no less important but smaller in scale is the work that we're doing on the library's medieval Arabic scientific collections. And this will really reveal a centuries-long intellectual exchange between East and West. Not only were the great centres of Middle Eastern learning translating the ancient Greek texts into Arabic, but they were of course themselves producing many new works of mathematics, of medicine, of astronomy and so on. And these found their way to the West and elsewhere and underlines really what has been this extraordinary exchange of ideas over the last 1,000 years between East and West.
So the main corpus of content that we're working with are records from the India Office records, which tell a unique story about the history of the Gulf region because of Britain's role and interactions with the ruling sheikdoms of the Arabian Peninsula. And those records span a period from the late 18th century right through to 1951 and tell a really fascinating story about the growth of trade, about relations, political relations, and so on, that any Arabic speaker in the world will be able to learn about through this program.
One of the most interesting items we have in the collection is an album of photographs of Mecca and Medina by the Delhi-based photographers H.A. Mirza and Sons. These photographers created a series of images which were later bound together as a volume by the Secretary of State for India Library, and we have the original binding here, so that was bound in sort of 1909. But these images themselves came singly into the Secretary of State for India Library collection as individual items within their mounts. And the way that we are currently looking at these items is as a series which is sort of documenting the Hajj at the specific moment that the photographs were taken in 1907. There's several reasons why, for me, this album is extremely important. One of them, of course, is the context of Mecca and Medina, which are two of the holiest cities within Islam. What's interesting is that this album manages to record some of the most holy places within Islam, but also secular scenes. So, for example, we have scenes of the pilgrims at Mount Arafat just going about their daily business. They're not really standing before God in the wukuf. They're actually just eating and standing by their tents and just wandering around. So it's an incredibly interesting sort of fusion of the kind of secular and also the sort of sublime, basically. Another reason why this series of photographs is extremely interesting is because, of course, from our specific point of view, it provides a kind of bridge across from Delhi in 1907, from Mecca and Medina in 1907, and all the particular history of those two places, but also it brings the British into that connection, because of course the British collected this album, they bound it together, they saw this as being a meaningful, important set of images from the Arabian Peninsula at this time.
We will be digitizing sound recordings in addition. We recognize in the program that we want to tell a story that is broad about the history of the Gulf and enable Arabic speakers from the Gulf region to contribute to that history. And one part of that is our sound recordings. So we have a treasure trove of sound recordings here at the British Library, shellac recordings, oral history surveys that tell a story about the emergence of music and oral history practices in the Gulf region. So we'll be digitizing those as part of this program.
ولن تبدي صباحا وعلى الآفاق أسدلت الجناحا وعلى الآفاق أسدلت الجناح.
We have, for instance, thousands of recordings in the British Library. Some of them are old shellac discs, some of them are beta discs or VHS disc, or here even reel-to-reel sound recordings, and most of them are not yet digitized. So we listen to it, we digitize them, and we catalogue them. Catalogue means we have a British Library catalogue here, and we entry certain content, who are the singers, who are the musicians, who are the people featured on the recordings. So my job is making sense of the sound recordings.
الخاص له الأول أحذر من الكبرى ترديك في كل شيء في ساعة الفكرة تمشي معذب وتصبح للملا عبرة.
I think we've worked mainly with the old recordings. We presently work on the shellac records from 1932 onwards, and they are taken in Bahrain, Kuwait and Iraq, mainly from these areas. And there's mainly the recording label HMV, His Master's Voice, and at that time they went to different countries to record the stars at that time. Being the stars at that time means they are forgotten nowadays, so I'm actually excavating this material. So I start with the very old recordings and slowly go to the newer recordings. Yeah, I just discovered this photograph of this group who were participating in the conference in Cairo, and they're from Baghdad in Iraq. They're all well-known musicians, most of them. And I discovered in our archive that we have most of the records being taken in Cairo 1932 in our archive, which these are the recordings here.
طلت يا ليل ولم.
We're also digitizing about 500 maps which tell a unique story of the development of cartography and mapping of the Gulf region. And so as we see from the 1820s onwards, the emergence of really good cartography of the eastern seaboard of the Arabian Peninsula, we start to learn a lot more about the countries that emerge along that seaboard.
A lot of these maps and decisions on borders were based on treaties that Britain had with local rulers and after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of the borders were based on kind of tribal allegiances, and some of them were quite arbitrary as well. And that becomes quite important in later history. As we know, there are a lot of border disputes that have happened in the area, not least the Gulf War, for example. So these documents have a great relevance today, sort of from a political point of view, and from you know how these countries came to be as nation states. All of these documents were diplomatic in nature, so they were classified, they were part of the India office and then transferred to the Foreign Office, and then they were released under Britain's kind of freedom of information rules. Another example of the kinds of documents that we have actually relate to the foundation of BBC Arabic in the 1930s. So in the kind of mid to late 1930s, there was starting to be a lot of radio broadcasts into the Gulf, and people started to own radio sets and could receive these. So those broadcasts were coming from Italy, the Soviet Union and Germany, for example. And Britain decided that they kind of needed to get in on this act. Because as they saw it, these were countries publicising propaganda into the Gulf, not just the Gulf, but the wider Middle East. So that was one of the motivations for setting up BBC Arabic. So on the 3rd of January 1938, BBC Arabic had their first broadcast.
We're also digitising about 90 Arabic language manuscripts, and these tell a story about the wider Arabic speaking heritage to which the Gulf region draws upon. And Those manuscripts tell a story of the transmission of science knowledge in the Arabic-speaking world, right from the medieval period to the 18th century.
The earliest manuscript that we're digitizing for this project is the earliest scientific Arabic manuscript in the British Library, and that's from the late 10th or early 11th century, and it's a text on chemistry. And the latest that we've got in the library is late 19th, even early 20th century texts, but I've actually scoped texts only up to the 18th century. This is another manuscript also from the 13th century by a man called Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, who lived in the late 10th, early 11th century and lived most of his life in Afghanistan. In this book he writes about the different ways that he knew of how to make an astrolabe. Particularly important thing about this book is it has the first description of how the internal gears worked inside a small handheld device. So this is the sort of the precursor to later pocket watches. And what al-Biruni did, which I think is particularly interesting, is he developed a new way to depict these gears. The gears that are on top are one color, and then there are gears drawn in red that show the ones that are underneath. If you drew them all in the same color, it would be difficult to tell how the gears are piled one on top of the other.
A really important aspect of the program is that we're creating digital surrogates for collection items that are very fragile. So that means we are preserving that item for the long term. But one part of that is also our conservation team, and they work with the paper to ensure that it is preserved for when it goes to digitization.
What we do is repairing items, but we also do a lot about supporting each strand of the project, and everything is related to, for example, handling of the items. We provide all the staff involved in the project with the training about handling the material they are dealing with, and then we also treat items when they need to be treated.
British audiences are fascinated to learn more about the Gulf region. The Gulf region is playing a growing role around the world. We see that from air flights to Dubai, to the role of the Gulf in British football, and we want to understand more about that region. And we also don't understand very well our imperial past in the UK. Children don't study that very much at school. And in this program, we'll be enabling British people to learn more about that history and our connection with the Gulf region.